Hey guys, welcome back to lecture number 2 on the American Revolution. Today we are going to get rolling and we're going to see some of the major events that take place leading up to the war itself. But of course, in John Adams' mind, these are the events in which the revolution actually occurred. Remember, in our lecture last time, we talked about how not only is the definition of revolution dependent on one's time and place, but also the fact that you had leading members of this revolution who saw the change in the people themselves in the decades leading up to the war itself. So we are going to jump into it right now. We're going to take a look at, today we're going to look at some of the British actions, what they did that really irked the colonists. We're going to talk a little bit about taxation without representation, why they were so angry about that. And sadly, we are going to end with violence. We're going to see the first bloodshed between the British soldiers and the colonists. So let's go ahead and get going with this lecture. And I'm hoping today's will be a little bit shorter than last time. I'm sorry, they usually don't drag on that much, but we had some introductory info to get through. All right, so I want to remind you, last time we talked about the French and Indian War. We discussed how the impacts that war had, not only in terms of getting more land for Britain, in which all of French Canada was handed over to the British. We saw everything east of the Mississippi River, all the way up to the Appalachians that had previously been French territory. That is now British as well. There's a lot of other side effects from this. So there's a lot of British soldiers that are going to be manning those forts out there. I'm going to mention that here in a second. But again, we talked about how the British are going to turn their sights back towards the American colonists, really for the first time ever in some ways. But we talked last time, one of the big themes was salutary neglect, where they basically recognized the American colonists and what they did for them and the economy, and kind of left them alone. Taxes that had been levied were not often collected. So, they've kind of allowed the American colonists to develop on their own, and that's both a blessing and a curse, at least for the British, because even though they still were this huge cash cow for the British, that means that the Americans have developed some sense of individualism that, especially when Britain starts to, make some decisions that the Americans don't agree with, they are going to be more apt to push for independence. Well, let's jump into one of the first very debatable British actions, and that was the proclamation of 1763. So, one group that we have not mentioned in all this, the French, British, Spanish, one group we have not mentioned are the Native Americans. And you have to understand that, this was not just open land. It's not as if when the French lost the war that poof, they just disappeared and it was all empty open land. There were many Native American groups present there. And I love this map that I posted here because you can see how a lot of those groups, where they were located, and a lot of diverse groups among Native American tribes. So in 1763, the British passed this law that said this proclamation line, and if it was a topographical map, you would see that it does kind of fall in line with the Appalachian Mountains there. But this would be basically the westernmost border of the American colonies. Now, what that meant was that if you were an American colonist, you were not allowed to pass or settle west of that proclamation line. Now, for the Americans, who, by the way, had sided, of course, with the British in the French and Indian War, had fought alongside them, they feel as if, they've just won this war, they should reap some of the benefit. And all they're going to get are the negative effects of this. So they're, first of all, angered that they cannot use this brand new, basically the size of the, British territory has more than doubled after this war, and yet the American colonists can't use any of it. They're told that they have to stay put. Well, especially that lucrative fur trade that we talked about the French enjoying, that is something that the American colonists assumed that they would take part in after this, and the proclamation line said no, that this is going to be reserved, and it was mainly to pacify those Native American groups. So angering the colonists, pacifying the Native American groups, and so... And the other issue here is that, all these forts, you can see a number of these forts on the on the map. You got Fort Duquesne, Fort Necessity, Fort Detroit. These are all being manned by British soldiers out there. And there are actually 10,000 British soldiers that are present on the frontier lines. And that soldiers are not free. You have to pay them salary. You have to pay to feed them, keep them. And so, a lot of these taxes we're going to talk about today were being raised to help, raise money for these soldiers to live out there. For the Americans, that's another thing that they're like, wait a second, we just won this war. We've defeated our enemies. Why do we need to have, 10,000 soldiers protecting this land that we can't even go into? So, a lot of Americans are upset about this because they desired to spread west. They're being denied that. And yeah, there's just a lot of things they're being denied. The first sign that things aren't necessarily going to go their way, even though they were loyal to the British. I should mention that this Royal Proclamation of 1763 actually does still hold some legal boundaries. In fact, there have been Native American groups in Canada that have used this in their court systems to defend their claim to certain lands. They said that this was given to them by this declaration, and they have won those claims. So this is still a law that stands to this day, at least in the British former British territories. Yeah, it was very very debatable, and it would of course be the first of many. So let's move on to our next one here. The Sugar Act of 1764. So, the British had put taxes on the American colonists, but they really hadn't collected it. So, the American colonists really did not feel that pinch. Well, in 1764, one way the British are going to try to raise money is by levying taxes, or levying duties, they called them, on imports of foreign goods. So if you were basically importing this kind of stuff into the American colonies, including textiles like clothing, cloth, wine, coffee, sugar, okay, where it gets its namesake. If you were importing these things, you had to pay basically a special tax on them. The language of the law actually said that the law was for, quote, improving the revenue of this kingdom, and it is just and necessary that a revenue should be raised, for defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the same. Well, going back to the last point, the American colonists had never had a standing army, and they're really confused as to why, now that the French are gone, they're having to support one. Why are we being forced to pay this tax, to pay for a standing army that we don't really need, don't really even see, not yet? They're questioning, now that our foes have been vanquished, why are we having to pay more taxes for a standing army? So, there's already a struggle that is growing even in the 1760s. The next one, the Currency Act of 1764. And notice how rapidly these are coming, right? I mean, for 100 plus years of no laws being forced upon the Americans, now all of a sudden they're getting brand new ones every year, every few months. This is building stress and building frustration amongst all the colonists. The Currency Act of 1764. The colonies were forbade to actually print their own paper money. So this had a big effect because, for those colonies that did have their own paper money, immediately that currency is worthless. You want to talk about how to screw up an economy immediately. You devalue its currency. Well, that's exactly what happens here. So the money that did exist in the colonies becomes heavily devalued. It really throws the economy in flux. Once again, the colonists, they actually reverted back to, in some places, bartering in order to sell goods. They couldn't even use paper money. Gold and silver are going to be used much more heavily after this. In fact, the Spanish real was the most common currency that would be used in the colonies up for a very, very long time. So, the British are trying to raise more money, and again, for their benefit is that if you force the American colonists to use your currency, then basically it's going to make it more valuable for you. So the Americans lose out, the British supposedly make more. Moving on, letter D, the Quartering Act of 1765. We are probably all familiar with the Bill of Rights, which of course will come much later. That states about housing soldiers and prohibits that from happening under the Constitution. Well, this is where it kind of gets its birth. So in 1765, this Quartering Act said that British soldiers would be able to be housed in barracks and public houses, so like hotels, if they ran out of room. Okay, so if there was no room for soldiers, this law allowed them to basically take over inns or stables or ale houses. So it allowed them to kind of take over more public areas, not necessarily residential. And I do want to mention, this is one of those that I think kind of we have that common myth that the British soldiers were basically kicking down doors and telling everybody get out, that they were taking over that didn't really happen. But it definitely was a concern. But even the law itself stated that the British soldiers were not to use really private homes unless they were vacant. Okay, but it does set up obviously a pretty bad situation in which I'm sure this was taken advantage of. It did state that the owners of the properties would be compensated, but again, that doesn't really matter as much to people. This idea that the British Army can basically come in if you are a business owner and they can basically take over your business and lodge people there in your quarters. That's something that really upset people. To go again from not having interaction with the British for 100 years to now all of a sudden having a standing army that can now possibly even come in your home. We're saying, wait a second, what is going on here? So, the colonists are reacting to these rapid laws with a lot of negativity, and rightfully so. 1765, this is a big one here, the Stamp Act. And this is where we start to see the colonists say, enough is enough, all right? And this is where the phrase no taxation without representation comes up. So what this act did, what the Stamp Act of 1765 did, created a revenue stamp. And I'm not talking about, a stamp that you lick. I'm talking about basically a rubber stamp, a seal that you had to get affixed on certain printed documents. The twist here is that it really had to be affixed to any printed material, all legal documents. So basically, pretty much every piece of paper in the colonies had to have this British stamp, this official stamp on that paper, or it was illegal. And so you had to pay to get this stamp. Not only, obviously this is not going to be something that's, this is not only just annoying that you have to get this official stamp, but, think about how often we actually use paper products, and the same thing was back then. I mean, this included newspapers, this included playing cards, anything that was printed on paper had to have an official stamp, and you had to pay for that. So, and of course, all those taxes had to be paid in British currency. Well, like I said, this is the first time where the colonists are really going to begin fighting back. You hear this phrase, this slogan rise up, no taxation without representation. So again, the issue so far really hasn't been about the tax itself, right? It's been about how it's levied. It's been about, the fact that the previous century, there hasn't really been any tax that's been forced upon them. And now all of a sudden we've got 5, in the midst of 2 years. But the real problem that the colonists had was that these laws were being passed down without any input, okay, without any input at all from the colonists themselves. And that's where they had an issue. No taxation without representation. And so the colonists believed that since these taxes had been levied without, they had been taxed basically as Englishmen, and they saw themselves as Englishmen, okay? There's not this idea of, American citizenry yet. They still see themselves as Englishmen. In fact, you read writings from, even the founding fathers at this time, they saw themselves as Englishmen all the way up through the war. I mean, they're going to send out the olive branch petition, and they mention in there, we as Englishmen, they're not saying we're completely separate Americans. So they are angry the fact that as Englishmen they have certain rights, and they believe that those rights are being denied, that they're being forced to pay taxes that they had no voice in creating, and that they deserve some of those rights to be recognized. Now, the British responded to this by saying that they had what's called virtual representation. You don't have to have direct representation, right? So you don't have to send a representative to Parliament to sit there and to debate because you have what's called virtual representation. Now, try to follow along here. This is the idea that the British, regardless of what far reaches of the island they come from, would have all the best interests in mind of everyone in the country and the empire. Therefore, those that are in far off distances, the colonies, they don't need direct representation because those who do represent them in Parliament or those that are in Parliament are supposed to represent them. Obviously, it doesn't work out like that. Even by this point, there had been a major cultural change that had happened between the American colonies and British. You think about these early colonies; they've been here for 150 years already. In fact, the really early ones, we're going back to early 1600s. So, by the time the Revolution actually comes up, we're almost close to 200 years at that point. So, the cultures are changing. The fact is, the British said that they're doing everything in the best interest of the colonies, and the colonies are saying, I don't think so. We want a say in this, and they're being denied that. So in October, they are going to gather together. This is a big deal. This is the first real organized resistance to these acts, and it is called the Stamp Act Congress. They just flatly put it out there. This is a Congress to talk about these Stamp Acts in particular. And so this is formed in the midst. There's actually some protests that have been happening, some large protests that had occurred in which people actually were boycotting British goods to try and put economic pressure, early on. But the Stamp Act Congress, the first gathering of, and they were elected officials. These were people from each colony, most of the colonies, that were elected to represent the colony in this Congress and to let Parliament know exactly how they felt about the Stamp Act. Well, they decided to meet in New York and discuss British policy. Some colonial governors refused to allow delegates to attend. So not every colony will be represented at this meeting. But those that do arrive in New York and meet over the next few weeks, they will come up with a document that is called the Declaration of the Rights and Grievances of the Colonies. And this is a petition that is sent to Parliament and King George III. It is signed on by 6 of the 9 participating delegates. So again, I mentioned in our last lecture the fact that the popularity of the revolution is one thing I think we overestimate. There were most likely, even at the time war broke out, probably only a third of the American colonies actually supported it wholly among the citizenry. So even here in this first real organized resistance, only 6 of the 9 colonies actually sign on to it. But 6 of the 9 represented delegates, they do ask for a repeal of the Stamp Act. That is the main part of the declaration. They included reasoning within this that specifically they said Parliament does not have the right to tax colonies because they didn't have representation, and they used, and we're going to go through some of these later on, but they used the English Constitution that says, listen, when we came over here as Englishmen, we retained those rights, and that's documented, right? You agreed to that, and one of those rights is that you can't be forced to pay a tax that you didn't have representation. So anyways, they put legal, these are a lot of, legal scholars, these are lawyers that are getting together, and they have a legal framework to their reasoning. It's not just pounding a table saying, I don't want to pay taxes. This is people that are creating a legal framework saying, listen, this is illegal what is happening here. And so we want you to repeal this law. Well, it did recognize, it was not just trying to break away. It did recognize, they said that, we understand the colonies owe, and this is a quote, due subordination, end quote. Okay, they owe due subordination. We are still under the crown, under Parliament. We don't deny that. But we just need to have representation. And, they understood Parliament had the right to regulate trade, but they just questioned its right to raise taxes, to levy taxes. Not everyone reacted to these, these stamp acts and all these various taxes in such a peaceful way. There were groups of people that called for violence, called for independence early on. So I want to talk very briefly about some of those groups. The main one was called the Sons of Liberty, and this was actually a secretive organization. I know it's become more, historical. We talk about it a lot more. But at the time, it was a secretive organization that was born out of this Stamp Act, and it formed to fight British taxation. You had mobs. They used some very harsh and violent tactics. But they had mobs that sacked the homes of local customs officials. So, you had British officials coming over that were in charge of, the docks, the trade that would actually go on. There were multiple officials that had their homes ransacked. A few people would even be killed. The lieutenant governor, so kind of like the vice president of Massachusetts, lieutenant governor, his home was sacked by the Sons of Liberty. They ransacked it, and they destroyed a lot of his property. Most of the Sons of Liberty actually denied women the involvement. Women are an interesting group here because we don't often talk about the roles of women until later on, but you got to understand that they are still there, and they obviously have very strong viewpoints on these things as well. But even here we have some kind of misogynistic, no girls allowed in this club. So there were actually women that formed their own group, kind of to rival the Sons of Liberty, called the Daughters of Liberty, and they did many of the same violent acts. 1767, there was actually a loyalist heckler that they captured, and these women basically took him, covered him with molasses to kind of embarrass him, and then covered him with flour. So we'll talk later on about tarring and feathering. This was a much more mild version, I guess, of that. But there's starting to become more radicalized voices, and I guess that's what I want you to understand. There will always be groups in society that are more radicalized, that want violence, that want swift action, and it's important not to give into radicalization, especially early on with this. But, there was something to their message. They were tired of this. And frankly, many of them didn't believe it was going to get any better. And they were right. So, the violent tactics, very debatable. We'll talk about how horrendous tarring and feathering was, but these Sons of Liberty become well known throughout the colonies, and they are going to make an impact. But definitely they're going to anger the British. So we'll mention that later on. Number 4, the Virginia Resolves. So you got to think about each colony as kind of their own separate country. So it's not states yet. If you had been born in Virginia, that was your land. And, I've read quotes by guys like John Adams who saw, Massachusetts as his country. All right, it's kind of weird to think about today, but there is no United States. There's no America at this time. You had colonies that acted as countries. It was on the path to be set up just like Europe was, right? With all these little countries that are going to be constantly squabbling over boundaries and all that. That's kind of what America was setting itself up for, and thankfully we avoided that mess. But the Virginia Resolves, the legislature in Virginia, was called the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses. This was their colonial legislative body, so they wrote the rules for Virginia. They were angry, just like everyone else, about the Stamp Act, and so they came up with a series of resolutions called the Virginia Resolves, and it focused on those legal arguments that, as I mentioned before, the English law stated that Englishmen could only be taxed by their elected representatives, and since they didn't have elected representatives at the Parliament level, taxation itself could only be legally done by the colonial legislatures. So they come up with these resolutions saying, we're actually the only ones that can tax us because we do not have representation in your group. This is where Patrick Henry is starting to make his voice well known. Of course, Patrick Henry is going to be a very, very important figure later on, but Patrick Henry gave support, a speech in support of these resolves. I want to read you a quote, and by the way, he was quite dramatic with it. I would have loved to have seen it in person, but he would always, just take the floor, and he had everyone's attention, whether you liked him or not. Quite boisterous and dramatic in how he told this. So I can just imagine Patrick Henry taking the stage and saying, this is a direct quote of what he said during the passage of the Virginia Resolves. He said, Caesar had his Brutus, Charles first had his Cromwell, and George III, and he kind of pauses there for effect. In fact, the opposition kind of cries out, whoa, easy. Like they see where he's going with this. And he says, George III may profit by their example. If this be treason, then make the most of it. I love that line. If this be treason, then make the most of it. Because there was question as to whether what they were doing, even gathering together at that moment, was going to be deemed illegal by the British. So he's saying, listen, if we're going to commit treason, let's go all in, right? Let's call them out for these wrong maneuvers. It didn't go over well, actually. Patrick Henry actually had to flee in the middle of the night because he was afraid that a lynch mob was going to come get him. So again, this is not a very popular sentiment early on, and that's a myth I want to kind of make sure we dispel here, that this was not a foregone conclusion. Not everybody was on the same side. I think too often in history, we kind of paint these big issues and say, well, all the Americans must have supported the revolution. All the British must have supported the British. It just doesn't work out like that. They were having these major debates on what action should take place because, again, in the moment, they have no idea how the stuff's going to play out. And we need to recognize that as well. Someday, future generations are going to be reading about the events of 2020, and they're going to be saying, what were those people doing, right? We got to remember, not everybody supported all the different policies. People are divided. People have their own viewpoints, and that was definitely the case back then, and of course today as well. On one of the assignments I'm probably going to have you look over here soon is on the Virginia Resolve, so we'll do some analysis of that later on. So the response, and I can't remember if nope, not yet. The response faced with growing violence, many Stamp Act collectors, these tax collectors that were forced to go out and actually, collect this money from colonists. Many of them are facing violence. I mean, homes being ransacked, people being tarred and feathered. Many of them do resign their roles or just frankly don't go around to collect the tax. So if you're the British, now all of a sudden you're not making any tax money because they're not collecting it. You have completely upset every colony over there in America. Is this really worth it anymore? And once they had that debate, they decided no, it was not. In 1766, the Parliament does reverse course, and they actually they repeal the Stamp Act, which is always kind of a surprising part, I guess, in my mind. But they do repeal the Stamp Act. Their bigger concern, frankly, is the American organizations. that they're forming to protest these things. The Stamp Act Congress, wait a second, you're telling me all the colonies got together and decided something politically? I don't like that. So that's what, that's the big takeaway from Britain is like, maybe we can pacify them to where they don't, mention the I word, independence. So, they do repeal the Stamp Act at that time. But what's interesting is they do pass another law saying, listen, we'll take away the Stamp Act. We get it. But here's another law, the Declaratory Act. We declare that Parliament has the right to create laws that are binding in the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever. All right. So, hey, listen, we hear you. We'll take away the Stamp Act, but we just want to let you know we could actually tax you. We could actually pass the Stamp Act if we wanted. All right. That's what the Declaratory Act says. We declare that we have the right to do whatever we want, whether you like it or not. So we'll help you out here. Just know that we're still boss. And by the way, I should mention Stamp Act, stamp taxes. We still have these today. Whenever you go file any really kind of official licenses, with the county, you have to get an official seal, and you often have to pay a fee for that. So it's not like this has gone away. In fact, this is pretty common in pretty much every country in the world that you have, at least in the Western world, that you operate. You have to pay for official documents and things like that. Well, anyways. So all this unrest, they're getting some response, but remember there's a big delay that's happening. Because once these decisions are being made, it literally takes weeks to cross the ocean, debate it, pass some kind of resolution, and then send it back. So it's like months that are going on between these things, and as you can imagine, how tense it must be, just growing, waiting for that response. You don't know what they're going to do, and it kind of leads to more fervor, I guess, on both sides. So things are going to start ramping up here pretty quickly. The next item, got a little ahead of myself. Sorry, I guess I don't have another slide for that. So even though Declaratory Act is highlighted there, go down to letter G, the Townshend Acts of 1767. This was a series of actually 6 different acts, okay, that was all packaged kind of together, known as the Townshend Acts. So a couple laws placed together. And there were a couple purposes for these. So number one, the British Parliament was trying to figure out a way to pay governors and judges. And, they were already getting paid, but they wanted to pay them more. Now, you might say, well, why are they getting a bonus? Well, think about it. If they're trying to keep, law and order in these colonies that are starting to get riled up about these taxes, you got to have, especially the executive and the judicial side, on your side. So the British Parliament is basically bribing these royal officials, paying them more, bribing these judges, paying them more, to keep them loyal. If a case comes up about these taxes, they better be siding with the British. So the revenue, or the Townshend Act in particular, did help basically pay those governors and judges more. Number two, it does help efficiently regulate trade. So this is, and we'll talk more about that in a second, but the Townshend Act's the second big thing you need to know is that it regulates trade. And number three, it did punish failure of compliance with the Quartering Act. There were sometimes that, especially in places like Boston, as that's starting to ramp up, that the British Army was trying to take over these, ale houses or stables to allow their soldiers to sleep, and they were being refused, and it was leading to a lot of consternation between the officials there on the ground and civilians. So basically punishing failure for especially colonies that decided we are not going to follow that, because you did start to have colonies nullify different acts. And in particular, New York had nullified the Quartering Act. And so one thing the Townshend Acts did was actually suspend the New York Assembly until they complied with that act. Okay, now we're entering kind of a whole new phase of this, right? So now, we're not represented in Parliament. We're having to pay taxes that we don't think we should have to pay. Now all of a sudden, you're telling us our legislature that we have elected as Englishmen, our elected legislator cannot meet. Okay, now we're starting to, not just be denied, but, we're abandoning democracy in its totality. So there's some big issues that are coming up. Moving down to the Revenue Act of 1767. This law in particular put taxes on colonial imports, kind of another round of taxes on things like glass and lead, paint, paper, tea. So there's more taxes being laid upon. And notice the things that are being taxed, right? These are not like specialty items that are paid for just by like big business or anything. These are taxes that everyone's going to have to pay. Like everyone. Everybody drinks tea at this time. Everybody's going to need, glass or, paint and things like that. Everybody's going to need paper. Everyone in the American colonies is going to have to pay for these taxes. So, this one specifically goes back to that issue of governors I had mentioned. The Revenue Act was to pay for the revenue of the governors. And that released them from, previously they had been paid by the colonial legislature. So this released them from that and allowed kind of a revenue stream. So again, the overall point of the Townshend Acts, that was the first one I mentioned. The Revenue Act took care of that. Again, let's talk about Boston really quick, and I want to move down to that Board of Customs Commissioners because we're going to see some organized resistance in Boston. Boston is, of course, right there on the coast, and major port. So a lot of goods that are coming in from Europe are coming through Boston at this time. Those that are responsible for customs, and John Hancock was one of the most important figures here. They are going to organize protests against these taxes. And of course, they get hurt a lot because, if less people are buying goods, that means less goods are coming through their ports and, they're losing out on a lot of money. So you have the Board of Customs Commissioners in Boston, and that also happened to be where the heaviest smuggling was taking place. And John Hancock was a smuggler. He did smuggle in items that were not supposed to be, or basically they would smuggle in items that were supposed to be taxed, but they came from other nations, so they didn't know about them, so they weren't taxed. So anyways, John Hancock was one of the biggest smugglers of all of them, and he's going to be the one that puts his big looping signature on the Declaration of Independence. I always wondered that, you see that picture of how big his signature was. He went first. If everybody else was just like, yeah, we'll just make ours smaller. He was probably like, wait a second. I didn't mean to make it that big. So this is going to spark a lot of protests in Boston in particular. So there's protesting, British goods. They're wanting to make sure that these taxes get taken care of. And this is where you also start to see some violence. You start to see tarring and feathering in Boston, in particular about tax collectors. And man, tarring and feathering was a brutal act of violence. They would basically strip down someone naked, usually completely naked, and then they would take hot, bubbling tar, and they would pour it all over their body. So, it would stick to the skin, and especially by the time it cooled, you would have a hard time removing that hardened tar off your skin without ripping off certain skin. I mean, this was just brutal stuff, very painful. And then to add to that, the embarrassment, they would cover you with feathers, so you look like a giant chicken, basically, at the end. It's not funny, but it basically, it was a very, honestly, I mean, this is, you're causing intense pain. I mean, to the point where some people were killed, embarrassment, tarring and feathering, I think we often kind of make light of it, but, man, it's definitely, something that, I don't know, it's kind of more mob mentality than anything. The British actually commented on this in one of the debates in Parliament. They mentioned how, and this is a quote, this British official said that Americans were a strange set of people, and that it was in vain to expect any degree of reasoning from them, but that instead of making their claim by argument, they always choose to decide the matter by tarring and feathering. So I guess some things maybe just haven't changed. Less talk, more tar and feather. That law would be repealed in 1770. So, the British, they're passing a lot of laws, are really not, very empathetic to the American colonists, but especially when they're going overboard. At times, they're scaling back a little bit, but it's more economic than anything. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. They're doing it because people aren't buying their goods anymore, and it's all about money. It's not about what's right for the American people, and they're going to pay a very heavy price for that here soon. All right, our last item for the day is the first bloodshed we see in the American Revolution. 1770, March 5th, 1770. There had been, I said, Boston is going to be the hotbed of this revolution. That is where the revolution was strongest. That's where you have the most patriots. That is going to be the center point of this, and it kind of makes sense that the first bloodshed would take place there. Now, because there had been such heavy protests, and especially among those customs commissioners leading that, the Sons of Liberty being born in Boston, you did have British place a high number of troops in Boston. In fact, there were about 4,000 troops in the city. And again, that is a visible sign of this growing tyranny, that these British soldiers are being stationed on the streets, and it would eventually lead to clashes. So I go back to like what David Hume said, that sometimes you end up creating the tyranny you seek to avoid. But in this case, the British had tried to take over, rule the streets with law and order, and it's going to lead to clashes. It makes sense. Well, we don't exactly know what happened, but because again, this is so heavy in myth, and it's so heavy in propaganda. That's going to be something we mention a lot here, because that picture down below that I posted on here is not at all how this thing went down, and we know that for a fact. That is a pure piece of propaganda. Look at the smiling soldiers on the British side. I mean, this is not. First of all, it happened in the dead of winter. I don't really see any snow on the ground, but we know that there was snow. That's kind of what started it here. So what we know that we can kind of ascertain is true. We know that there was some kind of verbal argument that sparked all of this, that basically ended with a British soldier slamming kind of the butt of his musket into a young boy's head. A crowd gathered to kind of defend the boy, and there began to be some snowballs and rocks that were thrown at these soldiers. Now, from the soldier side, I think it's always important to remember, perspective here. You got to look at both perspectives. From the soldier side, many of these soldiers are young kids themselves, 18 years old. That they are surrounded by a hostile group, and this does not excuse the action. Okay, not excusing it at all, but you got to understand how panicked they must have been, because they're feeling, they already know that they are in the center of this rebellion. Okay, they are surrounded by a growing mob, and now all of a sudden rocks are being tossed. They're getting hit. One of the soldiers got knocked down by a rock. Well, we don't know exactly what happened, but a shot was fired. And after that shot was fired, the rest of the soldiers opened up fire on the crowd. And even though the citizens were not armed, had been throwing rocks and things, but they were not armed, but the soldiers still opened up on that crowd, fearing for their lives. And they ended up killing 5 people immediately in that, and 8 total. In fact, the first to die would be an African-American man, Crispus Attucks. This event, though, and by the way, 8 people, I guess we could argue semantics here, but, exactly how much it takes to make a massacre, okay? Perhaps we live in a pretty desperate age, I guess, to where that may not qualify as a massacre anymore, sadly. But 8 people, think about why we use that term massacre. That is being labeled here because this is the event that groups like the Sons of Liberty needed. Okay? They needed something to cause sympathy for the American side that would cause people to be angry at the British. Up to this point, most people would say, I don't like paying taxes like anybody else, but what are you going to do? But now there's bloodshed. They are killing us, and especially when engravings like the picture down below get put in newspapers all across the colonies, and people are looking at this saying, wait a second, you're telling me that happened in Boston? And again, it didn't. Not like that. There was no officer, calling for, shots to be fired. But man, it paints a picture that gets you really feeling for the colonists. And so the Sons of Liberty, in fact, Paul Revere is the one that engraved that painting and propagated it throughout the colonies. Paul Revere will be a major propagandist this entire time. Now, of course, we know him from the famous Midnight Ride, but he will be famous earlier on. He's already a very wealthy, silversmith, typist, all those things. It's actually plagiarized. In fact, we know that there was a picture that looked exactly like this that had been created earlier than his painting. In fact, the original author, a man named Henry Pelham, actually wrote a letter to Revere, a very angry and insulting letter, accusing him of theft of his image, and said, quote, "It was as if you had plundered me on the highway." So, basically saying like he had robbed him of the wealth he would have gotten from this picture. Interesting side note on how all of this actually comes to end. This is really going to radicalize people, towards, pushing this move towards independence later on. But for the soldiers that were actually there, they were arrested, they were given due process, and had their day in court. No one in Boston would represent them except for one man. Okay. That was future President John Adams. John Adams agreed to take on the cause of those British soldiers. And, at tremendous risk to his own reputation, and frankly, his life at this point, he did decide to represent those soldiers. And he won. That's I think the other thing we often forget about this story is that John Adams actually won. So of the soldiers that were put on trial, all but 2 were actually acquitted, and those 2 that were found guilty, they were charged with manslaughter, so not even murder, but manslaughter, and as punishment had to have their thumbs branded, so a hot iron that branded them. I've always been amazed by John Adams. I'm not a big John Adams fan, but I think he was definitely a man of integrity, and I think he was someone that understood that everyone needs to have their day in court. I mean, here you had the most despised people in the American colonies, and he just believed that they were due justice just like anyone else. And I'm thankful people like that exist, because it makes things a lot fairer. Not perfect, but it does make things a lot fairer than the opposite of being found guilty until proven innocent, which I feel like we have a lot. Guys, that is going to do it for this lecture. So we will see how the country, the colonies react following this, and we're going to see things ramp up, and frankly, we're one lecture away from war already. So, hey, thank you again for tuning in, and as always, please email me if you have any questions, and look forward to talking to you later.